So Hydras and Hellhounds, Chimeras, Tauroxes and Valkyries? Let's see how the rest of the Guard motor pool is shaping up in the new codex. Hello and welcome back to Warspecs Tactics, where today we're talking Imperial Guard armour, this time focusing on light tanks, transport and support vehicles. Over the past week or so we've looked at the rest of the vehicles in the codex, including sentinels, battle tanks and artillery. So today I thought we'd do a bit of a catch-all roundup for everything else that we've not talked about, interesting new weapon profiles for things like the Hellhound and the Hydra autocannons. We'll take a look through each unit with their rumoured costs and rules from the new codex, and talk about roughly how they might be stacking up now we know a fair few details about the new book. As always, big shout out to Morty and Glorious channel for sharing these leaked guard rules to the internet. Thoroughly recommend checking out his channel if you haven't already. A tireless content creator of the Astra Militarum, he's basically got his hands on an entire leaked copy of the Guard Codex. Some of them are slightly older playtester rules, so likely a few things will have changed by the time they make it into print, but they should give us a very good flavour of the rules that are to come out in the book. Some stuff might change, but I suspect that the vast majority will stay the same. So let's take a look through some of the Guard's lighter vehicles then. We're going to look at the Hellhounds, Hydras, Chimeras, the Taurox and the Taurox Prime, and the Valkyrie. Hellhounds towards the start of 9th edition were one of the units that was just a tiny bit underwhelming I felt, but kind of usable. They've really been heavily codex creeps, and I think really their main issue is just not having anywhere near enough damage to compete against the other armies. It seems that in the new book from these leaks, they are remaining 110 point fast attack choice. The points aren't changed, but they have got some pretty decent buffs to their weapons. The main stat line of the vehicle also remains the same as well, moving 12, toughness 7 and 11 wounds, no different to before. The biggest buff to the unit comes to their weapons. Their primary weapons actually all count as turret weapons, which was something that I wasn't really seeing coming. So apparently like the Lehman Russ, they'll be getting the +1 ballistic skill and the ability to fire out of combat if the tank is locked up. The +1 ballistic skill won't matter on the auto hitting ones, but will be big on the melter cannon. But to be honest, just knowing that none of them get locked up in the first place is quite nice. They won't even have to target anything that's bogging them down that has charged through a volley of auto hitting Overwatch. The Inferno Cannon is an 18-inch flamer with 2d6 shots at strength 6, AP2, damage 1 and auto hitting. That one's fairly similar to before, it's just gained an extra pip of AP. Really not a bad thing to have in this era of Armour of Contempt. It will still utterly ruin light infantry squads, but still won't be super exciting against just about anything else. It's not too bad, though I'm still not sure it quite gets the nod at 110 points. The Chem Cannon is the Bane Wolf variant. That one's 12-inch range, and it seems that all the variants cost the same amount. The Bane Wolf now gets heavy D3+3 shots, strength of 2, AP-3 and damage 2. It auto hits again, and then auto wounds any non-vehicles on a 2+. This one got a trio of buffs, getting more shots, slightly better range and +1 damage. It was really underwhelming before, so it's good that they've actually made it kind of worth it. This thing will be pretty punishing against Space Marines, which look like its ideal prey. It will now be decently more efficient than the Inferno Cannon against them. Pretty nice, as before though it still needs to get very close. Finally, the Devil Dog has the Melter Cannon, 24-inch range and heavy D3 shots with blast, strength 9, AP-4 and damage D6+2 at base, getting an extra +2 damage if you get within melter range. Again, it's alright, I'm not sure it's quite going to outcompete Lehman Russes for damage, but it perhaps looks usable enough. The blast rule is quite nice, as it means that it could easily get an auto 3 shots against any big infantry units. Seems like it could be quite threatening, particularly if backed up by a multi-melter. Speaking of which, the multi-melter on the whole costs an extra 10 points, perhaps kind of borderline worth it. It does get you 2 very threatening anti-tank shots over the anti-infantry fire of the heavy bolter or flamer, and it gets the option of track guards and dozer blades, each of which cost 5 points. The track guards might be a bit of a letdown now though, as it seems that they're +1 save against damage 1 weapons, and Hellhounds really likes them safeguarding the movement, particularly with their auto-hitting profile, so they'd still be very threatening when bracketed. Otherwise, now all 3 variants are a bit more explosive, exploding on a 5+ rather than the normal 6, and I feel like they could be particularly interesting with their turret weapon rule. It looks like there's a guard stratagem to fire a turret weapon on death for 1 CP. That could be very nice for the Hellhound and the Bane Wolf in particular. Apparently they'd usually be hitting on 5s with that shoot on death, but if they're auto hitting anyway, then they could get a full round of damage for a CP when they die. Could make them a bit more interesting. Some big damage in the opponent's turn is nice. It'll be interesting to see whether they're worth it or not. I feel like they will be in direct competition with the Russes here, and whether overall it makes sense to have more damage and durability from the Russes or go with the cheaper Hellhounds. Still though, certainly a solid boost on its previous stats. It's hard to see them being less useful than they are now. Next up, we've got the Hydra, again at 110 points and unchanged from before. These things were very overcosted previously, taking a big -1 penalty when they're firing against ground weapons, and autocannon profiles are having a rough time of it at the moment. Armor of Contempt ignores AP -1, and there's also a lot of -1 damage about. Statline wise, the Hydra changed in line with the artillery vehicles, going down to a 10-inch move, so a bit slower, but getting +1 toughness to toughness 7, as previously it was toughness 6. The guns have got a small buff. The Hydra autocannons are now 8 shots at strength 7, AP -2, damage 2, rather than AP -1. They've got a little bit more bite against armor now, plus they now no longer have a penalty for shooting against ground-bound targets, so they're now going to be some pretty general purpose long-range fire. Really though, the Hydra is an anti-air tank, as you'd expect. It now really seems to function as such as well. You get double the amount of shots and +1 to hit against aircraft, which is a pretty massive boost to be honest, and it will genuinely be very efficient at taking planes out of the sky with that kind of profile. Accounting for a usual aircraft -1 to hit, you'd usually be getting 8 hits on them, and against a typical toughness 6 plane, you'd be expecting somewhere around 6 or 8 wounds on them, really not bad. In addition, the Hydra has gained a 1 CP stratagem to immediately shoot a flyer that comes in from reserve, so basically if Hydra's on the board, the planes just are really not going to have anywhere to hide. They're not going to be able to hide their profile behind terrain, and even if they start in reserve, then the Hydra can just shoot them anyway. I guess if planes become super prevalent in the meta, it could be an interesting choice to counter them, but I feel like maybe its damage output just isn't going to be quite good enough for a take-all-comers list. Again, I kinda suspect that with their greater toughness and bigger guns, the Rosses might do better than them. Moving on, we've got Chimeras. The Trusty Guard transport is now 80 points base. Previously it was really quite cheap at 70 for an armoured hull with those heavy weapons. Statline wise, it's broadly unchanged. It just appears to have picked up 1 wound. In terms of its weapons, it looks like it still gets the same options as before, though the turret weapons appear to get a small lift. They get the turret weapon keyword, so +1 ballistic skill and firing out of combat once more. The heavy bolter and the heavy flamer on the turrets both just have the regular profile, and the multi-laser gets the boosted guard profile at heavy 4, strength 6, AP -1 and damage 1. I still say that the heavy bolter is probably superior to that most of the time. The extra damage is nice, but it's certainly a bit closer. Otherwise it keeps its last gun array and transports 12, but it does appear to have picked up a really cool special rule. Rather than having to pay for mobile command vehicle as a stratagem, it looks like now that if you have an officer within it, they can just issue an order regardless, and that order comes out from the range of the hull, actually giving you a bit more wider coverage from it. That feels kind of fluffy to be honest. You often get guard officers using them as command vehicles to order the troops around, but you weren't really ever particularly likely to do that if it cost you 1 CP per turn to do so. I feel like that rule will make a lot of people quite happy, and seems like it could be an interesting way of keeping an officer just that little bit safer, while still being able to use their orders. Overall, I think between that boost and the extra ballistic skill on the turret, plus the extra wound, it is probably worth the extra 5 points, compared with the 75 points it was before. I feel like if you liked Chimeras in the previous incarnation, you'll still like them now. It does seem that the Chimeras might actually have a bit more credible competition though. Previously the Taurox was for some reason very overcosted at 90 points. I don't know why it costed so much more than the Chimera when kind of being the same / worse, but now it appears to be the cheaper of the two by 10 points. The stat line appears the same as it was before, just comparing it with a Chimera, it's more movement, less tough, and 1 fewer wounds now, and instead of say 2 heavy bolters, it packs 2 autocannons. Otherwise it doesn't appear to have that command vehicle rule. It comes with armoured tracks at base, so you get the +1 save against damage 1 weapons, and it transports 10 rather than 12. I feel like 70 points versus the Chimera's 80 seems like a reasonable trade-off. This thing does get you a little bit more movement, but it is decently less tough with 1 less wound and 1 less toughness, plus loses a lot of other things like the command vehicle, the last gun arrays, and 2 extra transport capacity slots. Looks like they're fairly well balanced, at least by my book. Let me know which one you think is better down in the comments below. Moving on to its Tempestor's cousin though, we have the Taurox Prime. Like the regular one, it looks like these guys have received a pretty decent points cut, though also one of their best weapons does look like it's been cut down a bit as well. The Prime is now 100 points, minus 15 points compared with its base cost before, and some of its other weapons cost even more than that. The only top-mounted gun choice that gets the extra cost now is the missile launcher for +10. It seems that Games Workshop are trying to actually stop them from being spammed as gun platforms a little bit. You now can't take more Taurox Primes than you can standard Tempestus infantry units. I guess that kind of makes sense, seeing as they're the units that they need to transport. And to be fair, if you're playing Warzone Nephilim, they need to have a unit to start in them at the beginning of the game, so that would kind of be a requirement anyway. Statline wise, the Prime is pretty much unchanged like the regular Taurox. It gets a small leadership boost to leadership 8, not relevant most of the time, but occasionally things key off it, say like Chaos Knight Dread abilities. Perhaps the most interesting part are the weapons. The Battle Cannon gets a 48-inch range, heavy D6, strength 7, AP-1, and damage 2. That one's largely unchanged, barring the D3 damage going to 2 damage, an upgrade against some things, but a downgrade against others. The Gatling Cannon, I'd say, has been nerfed overall. Previously, it was a big and nasty 20 shots at AP0, damage 1. Now that has been reined in significantly. It's now only 12 shots at strength 4, but it has gained a pip of AP, which will help it out against non-armor of contempt targets. To be fair, it doesn't cost any more on the vehicle now, which is an upside, and the AP will certainly help out against certain units, but I feel in general I would have much preferred it to keep the 20 shots and no AP compared with 12 and 1. I guess when you take the points drop into account though, it hasn't really lost all that much. Generally speaking though, it's a bit of a nerf against anything where the AP doesn't matter, like Armor of Contempt, but a small buff against things where the AP does count, at least in terms of points per shots anyway. The missiles are still the most expensive option. Rather than being plus 15, now they're just plus 10, so that loadout's also gone down a fairly hefty 20 points. They're still the standard missile shots apparently, so it does look like that loadout's just got directly better. Finally, apparently the Taurox hotshot volley guns got interesting as well. Previously it was just heavy 4 shots at strength 4, AP2, damage 1. Now that's been changed a bit. The Scion ones are rapid fire 2, but the ones that are mounted on the Taurox are now rapid fire 3. It means it's a small nerf at 24 inches, but a decent buff at 12. Bit of a side grade on that one really, though I guess if it ever gets locked up in melee, then they'll be hitting at full accuracy at least. Overall, at least on the raw data sheet, I feel like it's broadly good news maybe. The missile loadout got directly better. It's perhaps a side grade on the Gatling cannon, but at least it only costs 100 points for a fairly fragile vehicle now, and not 115. Finally, we have the trusty sky transport that is the Valkyrie. I feel like one thing that Games Workshop could do that would make a lot of people happy would be to tweak the balanced data slate rules in some way and allow you to run an air cavalry guard list again. Since the planes came out, that's been one way that you could run guard, even if it usually wasn't optimal, and I feel like a lot of people would thank you for bringing that build back, even if it isn't a top tier one. In any case, the Valkyrie has gone up 10 points. It was previously quite a cheap flyer at 120 points, but it's still not gone up all that much. It's still fairly durable with a toughness 7 and the 14 wounds for such a cheap plane. I think perhaps the main reason that it's gone up those points is that it appears to have gained itself a ballistic skill 3+. Not sure if that represents something like veteran aeronautica crew or something rather than hitting on 4s, but it's certainly going to give it a bit more bite when shooting. Otherwise, the stat line is broadly similar. It seems to have lost 5-inch movement over its maximum move. It is a bit more of a slow flyer compared with a fair few of the other factions' ones, but it's still likely to be able to get line of sight on what it needs to and get troops that it's delivering where it needs to go. Weapons wise, its side gun has gains the new multi-laser profile, which you can swap out for a las cannon for 5 points, and you can still take the door gun heavy bolters, reportedly 5 points extra here, which would seem borderline auto-include if they're going to be hitting on 3s. Otherwise, there's some new profiles for both the missiles. The Hell Strikes appear to be heavy 1, strength 8, AP 3 and damage 3. They seem to be mainly an anti-aircraft weapon with +1 to hit against them, plus damage D3 +3 versus enemy flyers. Otherwise, at the moment it looks like it's a free swap out for the multiple rocket pods. They were already kind of good in my opinion as a free trade out for that. Now though it looks like they've got even better. Each one of them is D6 shots at strength 6, AP-2 and damage 1, and they seem like the better choice of the two to give really quite some nasty anti-infantry fire on that. Overall looks fairly threatening. Maybe mount a couple of heavy bolters, those missile pods, and either a multi-laser or las cannon, and you've got a flyer that hits on 3s that's going to be at least a fairly decent threat to light infantry. Otherwise, and thankfully, the grav shoot insertion remains very much alive and well, and what's more, it also seems to have got slightly better. Models can still get out of the Valkyrie after it's moved. They can't just have him moved already when you set them up, and they can't charge out of the Valkyrie anymore, so it's no longer a strange strategy that you could use to try and get Bulgarins into combat that way. Otherwise, the units must still set up greater than 9 inches away from the enemy, but Scions do get a nice buff on this and can set up just anywhere that's just over 6 inches away. I guess it means they'd have a bit more precision as to where they could drop down. Getting within 9 inches maybe isn't quite as important as it was though, what with the hotshot lasguns getting extra range, and he still wouldn't be quite getting in the D6 plus 2 melter range with that. Finally, they still do have the risky deployment of dropping down. If the Valkyrie moves 20 inches or more when it uses this rule, then you roll a d6 per model that you've dropped. For each one that you roll, a model dies. It sounds like from this that you could potentially still go into hover mode and move 19 inches, I suppose. That could still get you a long way up the board and potentially strike against one enemy unit while not taking that risk if it was key that you didn't. Overall looks interesting. Again, it looks like it could be Kazakin or Scions that look like they might be the most interesting for that. You'd want a close range shooting units that can deal a lot of damage and ideally survive quite well on the front lines too. Otherwise, besides that, the Valkyrie can deep strike for free, still transports 12, and still has a hover mode that you can drop into if desired. I'm going to guess that the roving gunship rule is probably going to be replaced by just getting a flat extra ballistic skill. I'd be surprised if you have it going up to a 2+. Overall, it looks like Valkyries are going to be a little bit pricier, but still be an interesting option that you can get squads to the front line with, plus they're going to be a fair bit more dangerous when they're shooting now. I do like those multiple rocket pods, they make it into a bit more of a credible anti-infantry threat. So overall, some interesting changes, and I'd say broadly buffs for most of these vehicles. I'm still not convinced that the Hellhounds or the Hydras are going to be super strong, though I guess when we get the full codex out, we'll see in a bit more detail. I really quite like that officer change to the Chimera, and I feel like it might actually have some decent credible competition now from the Taurox, seeing as that's now cheaper. Otherwise, the Taurox Prime and the Valkyrie both look interesting as premier transport options. I feel like how useful they'll be will depend on how hard things like Kazakin or Scions can hit from the drop. If they really can deal some massive damage with their special weapons and hotshots, then I feel like they could be useful. Let me know your guys' takes on the units though. Which ones do you think are looking hot or not? I'll certainly be interested to see their full profiles once we do get the actual codex and the rules released. If you enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly be keeping up with any news of the Guard releases and talking about any previewed rules or new models that Games Workshop show off, and I'll certainly review the codex in full once we get it. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that one linked down in the video description. It is what allows me to keep on making videos like this so often, and channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.